Hey everybody, and welcome back to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest is Paul Gambino. He is the author of 5 novels on what I would call the macabre or macabre. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that French word, but it means dark and death-related, and he is definitely an expert, and he's awesome. This was a great interview. He's really intelligent, really smart, well read, well, does tons of research, and he has some really interesting heartfelt opinions on death, dying, our obsession with true crime and things like that. The interview definitely was a very pleasant surprise, meaning he was able to answer every question I threw at him with really deep, thoughtful responses, and that's all I could ever ask for as an interviewer. But also on top of that, I think we get into some pretty interesting topics, like where are we now? Is it going to be different this time? Do we really feel that removed from the Victorian era, or are we actually kind of just humans being dropped into different generations, but kind of always human? We get into the nature of evil versus insanity. And so anyway, if you like true crime and you like those kind of things, you're going to love this episode. And if you don't like them, you're still going to like it, because we actually talk about the heart side of it and about the victims and how they're ignored often, and how the media just wants to cover the people who make people victims, as opposed to the actual sadness and what we should be feeling and bereaving and grieving on. So Paul's a great guy. It was a really fun episode to record, just because I actually follow him and read a lot of his stuff. So sometimes I have authors who I then end up buying their book and reading it because I've never heard of them. But with Paul, I actually had been following him and asked him to come on the show. And I was pleasantly surprised when he said yes. But on top of that, I just think what he's done is amazing. So, and he gets into the nuances of his 5 books. And I thought that was really helpful too, because if you go online and you want to buy one to start with, I think he gives you kind of a good idea of where to start. And so one of his books is called Skulls, and it's all about people who collect skulls. And then he gets into the part about how some people just have one skull, and what's weirder, someone with 100 skulls or someone with one skull. And it's a fun moment. I'm not going to ruin it because he talks about it. Other than that, personal life's going pretty well. I had this weird ugly condition on my elbow called bursitis, and it's this weird thing inside my elbow that swelled up. I was horrified. I thought I was going to die. Speaking of death, no, I didn't actually, but I was horrified, and I went to a doctor and they said, relax. And then I went to a second doctor after they told me to wait 4 days, and they said, relax even more. So I'm relaxed, but bursitis, it's a real thing. Look it up. Anyway, very happy to have recorded another episode of Coffin Talk. Once again, this is a great interview with Paul Gambino, and we'll see you on the other side of this message. Bye. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And this week, our guest is Paul Gambino. He's an internationally published author whose books explore society's enduring fascination with mortality and the macabre. A prolific writer, he's best known as the author of Morbid Curiosities, Skulls, Killer Collections, The Art of Gothic Living, and his latest book is Beyond the Veil. And obviously, he's pretty much an ideal and perfect fit for our show. So without any further delays, how's it going, Paul?
Yeah, great, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure to have you on. And man, I follow you on Substack, and I read every single article you release. And you're really incredible. What you've done is pretty amazing. So I'm excited to ask you a lot of questions. Before we get into that, I always ask every single guest, how old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
Well, 60, gonna be 66. Grew up in New York, and I guess I am the end of the boomers.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about this morning. So my mother is 100% Sicilian, from Sicily, and her maiden name growing up was Provenzano, which is extremely problematic over there. It's the name of the most notorious crime boss. Your last name is Gambino, and you're in New York. What was it like growing up with that last name? Has that been an issue for you?
Well, I grew up in the neighborhood, so it was never a problem. And as I got older, it actually, everybody asks the obligatory, are you connected, or what's the connection and stuff like that.
I'm not asking that.
No. And then living in an Italian neighborhood, it actually worked in my favor. You know what I mean? So people just but I wasn't an anomaly. See, that's the thing. You know what I mean? So, oh, Gambino, no big deal. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
know, so you know, but when you left it's and to this day, it's still like, even though the Gambino family is nowhere near as powerful as it once was, you know, or in the news as much as it once was, people still like, oh, well, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, and the Provenzano, same thing. I mean, Tony Pro and all that. You know what I mean? That was,
That's
you
my
know.
grandfather's name, Tony Provenzano. You can imagine
Oh,
how.
really?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
And I used to like when I was young, I bragged about it because like Goodfellas was my favorite movie. You know, I just like
Oh,
wanted ties, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm actually really glad I'm not. And then I taught
yeah.
Italian students, and one of them took me aside and was like, you should not brag about that. She's like, that would be like someone bragging about having the last name to us. And I was like, oh,
You're right.
that's
That's a good
okay.
analogy.
Yeah. So, and I was just one of my jobs is indexing books, and it was comparing Trump's adoration of the Gambino family and stuff. So it was like interesting in the timely
Wow.
way. But anyway, back to you. I would love to know when, in your opinion, your morbid curiosity started.
Yeah, I guess it started because I grew up with my grandparents, and when and you know, this is like very personal, but it definitely is part of the thing. When I must have been about 11, my grandmother like suffered a brain aneurysm. So, but she didn't die, and so I lived there. So at 11, she had a brain aneurysm. At 13, she had a heart attack, and a whole series of things. So, and she wound up living till I was 31. You know what I mean? But there
Cool.
was this pall of potential, you know, death was, I guess, like always looming over. You know, and so I think, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, and you know, and even though I've been to therapy and stuff, that never really was. I adjusted to it very well. Well, I don't know, Cole. I don't know if I've adjusted to it well. I guess this is an outgrowth of it, you know, just being surrounded by it. And but it's interesting because growing up in that household, it was twofold. One, that was the negative end of it, but the other thing was being surrounded by my grandparents lived in that house. That was their parents' house, and it was a really interesting house. It was a five-family small apartment house, and at one time the first floor was like a pool room. There was photos of like people being laid out, you know, for the funeral on the first floor. So, you know, it had all that. So, and I was surrounded, and there was a lot of old furniture. The furniture was amazing. At the time, I didn't realize it, you know what I mean? But it was very Gothic and, you know, very like turn of the century, meaning 1800s to 19. So I was always around that. I was one of those guys that was always opening up drawers, you know, to see and it was all this old cool stuff. So I guess, you know, being surrounded by old stuff and stuff that, you know, was no longer in existence, whether they be inanimate objects or actual people, you know, I guess kind of made me kind of comfortable with that whole like for instance, in my room, there was a full size, and I have it now, a full size Saint Sebastian in its reliquary, you know, so it's with the arrows, and he's hanging on the tree stump and everything.
Wow.
And it didn't bother me, you know. People would come into my room and be like, "What is this?" You know what I mean? And I didn't realize that. Oh yeah, that's probably kind of odd, you know, to have, or you know, kind of unsettling. So that's one reason why I think I'm fine with it. The other reason why my wife says is, "Oh, I try to surround myself with all this kind of stuff because of the fear of death." So it's like a manifestation. If I can like, you know, I can control it if I have these, you know, artifacts around me that are representations of, you know, mortality.
Well, that's interesting because the perspective of this podcast is Americans shun death, don't want to talk about it, fear it, never deal with it, and then all of a sudden it hits us, and it's a negative because we're not prepared for it. Whereas in a healthy culture, in my opinion, it would just be as normal as waking up and going to sleep because it is that normal. It's something that's going to happen to everyone. It will happen. I have two young daughters. They're dealing with their awareness of it because one of their grandmothers just passed away, and
Mm.
they ask me, "Are you going to die?" And I just look at them and I'm like, "Yeah, 100%. Like I will. You will live on Earth without me, God willing." I
Yeah,
want
sure.
them to understand that it's a good thing that they will live past me, but I also understand. But throwing it back to you, your wife says it might be because you have a fear of death, but do you feel like you have a fear of death, or do you feel like you just think about it?
No, I think it's twofold. I think it's like the universal one of the universal explanations is just that unknown thing. So I don't fear the actual dying, just fear that the unknown aspect of it. And somebody I forget who it was. I think it was Degrassi who said, "You remember before you were born?" And of course, you say no. Was that bad? No. Well, that's the way it's going to be when you die. You know what I mean? So it's not bad. You know what I mean? It wasn't bad before you were born. So why shouldn't it be bad? Then you know what I mean when you're dead. So yeah, I don't know. You know, I can't say that I think about it a lot. I don't think about it in the sense of am I going to die? I think about death a lot. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
particularly thinking about me dying. You know what I mean? Because despite all this, I still think I think we all believe that despite even what you said, there is some kind of subconscious sense of immortality, or a lot of times we would
Yeah.
not act the way we act because we'd
Yeah.
be like, if this was really, would you know what I mean? You would,
Yeah.
you wouldn't do that. You would be living your life a lot different if you didn't think it was going to go on. At least I think I'm at an age now where I think I understand. My grandfather lived to be pretty old, and I used to get angry at him because he was healthy and he would say that he was tired and he was, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? And I used
Yeah.
to get really angry, not at, never
Yeah.
vocalized it, but I'd be like, Bob, you know how many people would trade that, you know what I mean, to be your age and be physically healthy, and for you to say that you're kind of tired of being here. And as I get older, I kind of can understand. I'm not saying I am, but I can kind of understand. Yeah, you know what I mean? The world has moved on. It's really for another whole group of, people and stuff. And, I'm tired, you know what I mean? So, yeah, it's a different way to look, and
No, I think that's
uh,
pretty profound. Like you're 66, I'm 44. I felt it creeping in my late 30s, and now it's really starting to hit me. It's not I can't wait to leave, but it's definitely like, all right. Like I don't need to
yeah,
see in 40 years another like big ado about like the who's playing the Super Bowl halftime show. Like I've seen
yeah,
this show a few times. It's starting to get as, less interesting. And I'm not even sure if we're making progress, and I mean
I
like,
know, yeah,
on any level. Yeah.
yeah. I'm at the age now where I'm like those people that, like, I don't care. Like, I don't, not that I don't care, but like, certain things don't matter to me that mattered at one time, like
Yeah.
and you're like, wow. And it really doesn't. And it's not apathy.
Hmm.
It's just, I guess, a different set of priorities, and or the priority list gets smaller,
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, no, you're stressing over that, or considering that, or this or that,
Well, and
because
also,
I
oh, sorry,
Mhm.
please.
No, that was pretty much
Well, I
it.
was going to say what you're saying to me sounds like acceptance of reality, acceptance of like you can't change
Yeah,
as much as you once thought,
right.
right? Yeah.
That's a very interesting way to put it too, about that whole thing. It, like, you know when, like, you're still at the age where you could pretty much do whatever. You could change the world, and if you wanted, you know what I mean, in a certain way, and you have that actual, the logistical time frame to do that. I mean, you know it'd be really kind of odd if at 65 I'm gonna, unless it was an artistic endeavor, you
Hmm.
know what I mean? You
Yeah.
really, you know what I mean? And you could change the world that way for sure, you know what I mean? But there were certain things like, and this is very, and I'm not like this any more than the average person, but you'll look at like something crazy will come up on a feed, and it'll be like a $25 million house, and you'll think, wow, I really will never be able to afford that
Yeah.
house. You know what I mean? Whereas at your age, you could theoretically garner enough, equity that you could do that. But I'm actually at a point where that'll never happen. Now and it's not crushing to me or anything. It's just a fact, and it's like,
Yeah.
wow, that's kind of weird that there are certain things that have a time limit, and that's one of them, of certain physical goals that potentially you can't reach anymore. That, which is
Yeah.
odd, but based on a time frame.
Yeah. It's also like strange for me, at least, like noticing the aging process. Like the vice president is, I think, a year younger than me, and
Yeah,
he's
that's
like terribly immature, and it's like sad for me that someone roughly my age could be that immature. Like it like
Yeah.
actually makes me sad. I'm like, wait a second, like we grew up on the same timeline. Like you saw
Yeah.
Reagan, you saw that, like so that's part of why I said like I'm kind of like seeding like hope that suddenly humanity's gonna get it. You know, like
Yeah.
I just think
Yeah.
you're gonna get it, Paul, when you get it, and I'm gonna get it when I get it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel, just hopping back to something you
Yeah.
said, you said that, Degrassi, his quote, and we talked about like it's unknown, but do you believe that in your heart of hearts that nobody knows what happens when we die? Do you think anyone knows?
I'll never discount anybody's opinions. So they may, and if I don't, I will never say I don't agree with someone's opinion on something, because so much, like when that, and that's, it's a roundabout way to answer your question, because based on the analogy of, I think when people thought like, like the Wright brothers said they would could fly. Those guys are crazy. That's impossible. You know what I mean? And so many of
Yeah.
those kind of things. I am not intellectually or sensitive enough. Back then, I would have said, "Oh yeah, those guys are crazy." Then there's no way they're going to be able to fly. But I think now it's like, but that was very early on in my life. But like I say, I might not believe you. I might not agree with it, but I won't say you're wrong. You know what I mean? So I don't know. So in terms of that, I'll accept any potential, evaluation of what people believe may be on, till it be nothing, or till it be totally, Judeo,
Yeah. Yeah.
Christian belief, or you know what I mean. So I don't know, but I'll respect anybody's potential, because it really is, I don't know how anybody can know. I mean, it's nice that. It'd be lovely to think on certain things, and I don't mean lovely in a belittling way.
Mhm.
It would just be
No,
comforting.
yeah.
You know what I mean? If the more pleasant ways, or that there's something going. But then, yeah, that's obviously that's a huge question. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
No, no, totally.
And I know you're not asking me like,
No,
to
no.
defend it, Paul. What's
Definitely
the
not.
answer?
But I am trying to see with every guest I have, like,
Yeah.
where they're like the intersection of certainty and fear, and and what's in between. Because, like, for example, if I'm on a plane and it jolts enough, I
Yeah.
have a panicked reaction, but I
Yeah.
don't actually like think like metaphysically about death, and, like, you know what I mean? It's just like there's a part of me that is always going to be scared of dying in the moment, but then there's the ability to think about the future and the past and our lives and where we are and consciousness and all that. And so this show kind of gets into both, and you're doing a great job of talking about both. And I love your Substack. I mean, I gobble it up. And one of my favorite articles was about like the history of like the parlor room, which you kind of talked about with the first floor. That
Right.
was,
Right.
yeah, and that was just one of my favorite. I mean, I like really actually
Oh
enjoyed
no,
it
I
all.
appreciate it.
And one of the questions I've been dying to ask you is like, what is your research process like? Because you do like I'm an editor as well as many other things, and you're a very concise, great writer. I mean, your
Yeah,
editing
thank you.
process is wonderful. You leave no detail out. You leave me wanting a little bit more, but you also like state things with like a great certainty based on evidence. So not just like sounding cocky and So what is your research process like?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, the 4 books previous to Beyond the Veil were not research books, in a sense that they were text driven. Those first 4 books are visually driven, and the research is a little different. The research is, in a sense of, kind of like seeking out or the collectors and stuff like that, because those first 4 books, or all my collector books, are on private collections. To me, that's the more fascinating thing. There are museums that have incredible oddities collections, or collections of osteology and stuff like that. But to me, it's more fascinating. Like for skulls, for instance, that book is people that collect human skulls, and there are people in that book. That book was from people all over the world. Not that all of them are, but there was a lot of Europeans and South American people in that book, and there are some people that have hundreds of skulls. But there's people in there that have one skull, and to me, that one skull person, obviously, it maybe at certain aspects is more fascinating than the person that has 100, because like the 100 person, they're a skull collector. The guy that has the man or woman that has, or the person that has one skull is like, why do you only have, like, why do you have this one skull? There has to, that's the thing. So that kind of research was different. Beyond the Veil was a great experience in terms of, because can you imagine, like with the books, over the 5 books, there must have been about well over 100 people, well over 100 people that I had to deal with, who were very nice, and but it's logistically, it's a bit of a nightmare. You have to go, across, organize photographers to go. You have to deal with them personally. You have to, get a lot of information out of them and stuff. But as an editor, also, I'm sure you can appreciate the fact of like Beyond the Veil, I just had to sit down and do research. Not, any speaking or any interviewing process was me just extracting some information that was, I knew where I wanted to go with it. A lot of the other books, you'd walk into a situation, you really weren't sure where it was going to go when you got into the physical presence of the thing. So that was nice. So my research thing was, nothing other than I love the research, and like you said, I do appreciate that, and especially if you're doing online research, you have to keep going back and back, because more and more there's misinformation out there, and you know what I mean. And it's like, you have to really, and that can really derail, derail a book like Beyond the Veil, if there's like, like for instance, and I don't know how to put this. I spoke to an authority on something in this book, and I'm not going to cite what it was, but they had it. They were an authority. They truly were, other than this thing. And they cited something that I had to dispel in the book that they really believed. And I believe those small things that I can dispel kind of plays to what you're saying, where like, you're like, okay, this guy just didn't write everything that was in there. Like, because the things I dispel are the things that you wish they were true. You know what I mean? Like, I think I even did a Substack on that, like 5 Victorian, like, things that you wish were true. You know what I mean? Because they just make for better, cocktail talk, but they're not true. You know what I mean? So that kind of stuff's fascinating. An interesting thing about the research in Beyond the Veil is I went into it thinking, okay, like other than maybe Egypt. I mean, I'm sure there's a plenty more, but Egypt has a huge ancient Egypt, like had a huge death culture, right? So that, like, you would think, oh, if you're going to do a book on death culture, Egypt. Well, I didn't want to. That's not really my thing or my time period. So Victorian is, the next, most logical in my head and the most comfortable to go in. But the big surprise about doing the research for that book was that I wound up doing not very little, a lot less research on the dying end of it, and it was more about how they lived, because so much of how they lived wound up to be why they died. So, you know what I mean? Why death was so, such an all-encompassing thing. So that was an interesting thing, and that was an interesting thing in terms of the research, because I was familiar with a lot of the death practices, and so were a lot of Victorian, Victoriana people that are into it. So I think some of the appeal of the book is that, of course, all those things are mentioned and all those things are cited, but it's almost like, and there is a section on art, being, fine art and music and poetry and everything and writing. But it's like how much more interesting it is to learn about history if you're in an art history class, and the paintings of the time period kind of tell you what was going on politically, socially, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's a much more interesting way than it just being dry, facts, about what it is. So I think that's what's interesting about the book, is that how they went to work, where they had to work, what paintings were popular, what were people reading, who were the celebrity serial killers of the time, you know what I mean? Like it all, if you look at that, you can really understand why they had to embrace that so much, you know what I mean? And why the attitude was what it was.
Actually, that's a great. I already wanted to ask you this question about. Do you feel like modern culture celebrates serial killers and killers in general with mass shooting and all that kind of stuff, like more or less or the same? Because you're an expert on this, I'm not. Hi, everybody. This is Mike Oppenheim, the host of Coffin Talk, the show you're currently listening to, and I'm interrupting to ask you if you would mind doing me a favor and subscribing to my online publication called You Are Here on Substack. It features weekly essays. I also have fiction, and of course, there are links to the podcast and all the bonus episodes. It's completely free, and I would love your support. So please head over to mikeyop.com, that's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up today. Thank you. Bye.
Well, I did do that book, Killer Collections, and that was an interesting book.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting book for two reasons. One, because of the topic and the stuff, but the people that collect true crime artifacts, or what's known as dark artifacts, or there's a term called murderabilia, which people don't really like to use outside the thing. It's kind of got a derogatory name. But those two people, that group was interesting because there were two kinds of collectors there, and that was collectors who wanted to have nothing to do with we'll just use serial killers because other people. There are a lot of other crimes that go on that have a very storied history that just you don't know, not you personally, but most people don't know about and stuff. So we'll stick to the serial killer people, and there was a whole group that wanted to have nothing to do with those people. They wanted to collect the pieces, whether it be artwork, letters, evidence, stuff like that. And then there was a whole group that wouldn't really collect from the serial killer unless they were able to develop a personal relationship with them, meaning like actually going, to the prisons and developing a one-on-one, So in terms of it being popularized and using those two groups, I think it really is a huge, because social media hasn't really done, unlike other aspects of pop culture, I don't believe social media has really driven the true crime, fanaticism. I believe it's actually streaming TV or cable TV, those documentaries, you know what I mean? And the shows, they've been gobbled up and they can't get enough of it. The school shooting situation, I have to admit, and I'm not well versed on it because I don't find anything fascinating about it. It's just too brutal. So not that it's not not that it's not brutal, all the other, everything else, but
No, I think you're being very fair. There's like a big difference. Like, like I said, I do follow you. I do read a lot of what you write, and like, you're not like writing gossipy, like enjoy this stuff. Like you're really actually just you're a documentarian. I believe. I think that you're like really documenting the history of savage violence. Maybe that's like what I would call it. I don't know.
Yeah. And another interesting thing that I found about the people that do collect on both sides of the thing, they would always say to me, because I would ask the normal questions, do you get any pushback or do you get any, from family members or stuff like that? Many times would come back to me and say, I know more about the victims than most people ever do. And you know what I mean? Everybody knows about the killer, but I know about the killer, but I've also made it a point to know about the people that they've killed and try to keep that in their own collection, that legacy alive, or that, not to sweep that under the rug, that, the only thing that's important is the killer. Is that a justification? I don't know. And I think for some maybe, but for some it really is. They're deeply moved by the fact that, and that's when you watch those interviews. If when you watch enough of those interviews and they start talking about, when they get past the killing and then they start things will start happening where the other family members will be brought in for whatever reason. Then the thing gets so dark, and you're like, this is just horrible what this person actually did to not only that person, but to that family. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, it really takes it all to another level. And it's dark history, and I'm as fascinated by it by as the next person. And for the longest time, till I was in my 30s, and until someone told me this, like a respected someone I ever thought knew something, I always assumed if you kill somebody, you were crazy, you know? And this person says to me, no, there are people that are actually evil, as they're completely sane. You know what I mean? And that came to me very late in life, that like,
Me too.
like,
Yeah,
how can that be? And I
yeah,
think that's what my fascination is with those people. It's like, if you told me you were insane, I could maybe understand it, but society and the medical community saying, no, this person is completely sane, and they're still able to do these things.
yeah.
That's like, you're looking at, if you want to say, if you want to see the oddest thing in the zoo, if you want to see the like, out of humanity, that's got to be one of the oddest things, that someone can be completely sane but actually be evil.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And
yeah.
you know and you
The
know
I don't know if you've read the famous author Hannah Arendt, who like survived the Holocaust, wrote a lot about this, the banality of evil, like
oh
how boring it is, like how not exciting. It's just like this real presence throughout humanity. And like, she's writing about the Holocaust, which is
yeah.
a perfect example of what you're talking about. There's not a lot of insane like writings in that. It's
Right.
actually like very elaborately detailed evil. It's just like, yeah. Um,
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like you don't want to believe it for so long,
mhm.
or it's just like, um
Well, we have
but
that in
yeah.
common. I definitely came late to the like, oh, people are actually just evil. Like it
Yeah.
really, it shocked me, and it was in my late 30s, and now I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of, and actually I think it helps both of us sleep at night to learn that, only because you can't stop that. You can't like fight
No.
that. Like that's just a thing that exists, and like, it's hard, like with technology, like, do we get rid of guns? Do we get rid of the internet? Do we get rid of every single thing that can be used for evil? Well, then we're going to have nothing, so it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, we're definitely at, it feels like a crossroads, artificial intelligence, robots, like all this stuff. But I don't think it's a crossroads. I think like trains probably came across the same way, electricity,
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
yeah. So,
Well,
um,
like in that was a huge thing in Beyond the Veil too, or that Victorian era stuff. I mean, those poor people, they didn't know where to go. I mean, with this whole industrialization and all
yeah,
this
yeah,
quote unquote science coming in, and it was saying that religion, was kind of, laughing in the face of religion, which was their thing forever. You know what I mean? It was, and then people are dying all over the place. They didn't know where to blame it on. And what I found, talking about the Holocaust and stuff, I made a post, and it happened more than once. There was a cholera outbreak in London. It was called the Great Cholera Outbreak. I think it was 1863, or around that. And it was traced back to this pump in London where they could track most of where this cholera was coming out of, was in that water thing. And I made this post, an innocuous post about the cholera, epidemic or outbreak on Instagram, and people were posting, "Oh, that was the Jews. They were putting cholera." Of course, I took them down, but I was like, it was. I was like, how,
yeah,
people are just so want to blame on groups of, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
how could you, why, how could you, I just couldn't, like,
yeah.
and how,
It's
I don't know. It was mind blowing,
Yeah,
that,
it's tough. And actually, I think, in closing up the interview, wrapping it up, I think what you talked about and what I'm really glad I asked you about is like, when I saw you come up on my social media feed, at first I was like, oh, this is like a bot. Like, there's no way someone does all this. Like, like this is just I'm in their algorithm because I do a show called Coffin Talk. And then like I started like actually reading and I was like, oh no, Paul's like a real guy. And then I was excited for this interview because I was like, this is going to be one of two interviews. Like it's going to be exactly what it was, which is a great guy with a great heart who's intelligent and has a passion and follows it. Or it was going to be, the total opposite, which is like, oh, I'm talking to Hannibal Lecter's like best friend here, and like so thank you, because I think it's awesome that you're doing what you're doing, and I do think you're doing something very valid and very helpful, and I think especially comparing Victorian era to now, and just kind of helping us see the long history of like the fear of death, what death is, how people, he had another great, again, there's going to be notes for how to find you, but his Substack is prolific as well as his books that are out on Amazon. And I would encourage you to check all of it out. But one of your articles about the photographer who was always like first at the scene, yeah, that was like incredible for me. Cause that guy's right in between us, like, yeah.
There's tons of bios on him, and there's actually tons of documentaries on him. So they're out there if you want to see them. It's real good.
Yeah. So anyway, in closing, I always give my guests the floor at the end of the interview. Is there anything you want to tell our audience? Any advice you want to give everyone?
No, I just really thank you for having me on and talking about this topic in a way that's less fearful and just more. Without it being emotionless. It's not that it's emotionless, it's just an inevitability. Hopefully it's longer, way down the line than in the immediate future for all of us and stuff, But I just really thank you for being here and listening to me, and I appreciate all that you do.
Awesome. Really appreciate you, Paul. Paul Gambino, everyone. He's prolific. He's not hard to find, but of course in the notes will be 2 links at least, one to find his books and one to find him on Substack. He's a great follow. He's a great guy, as you've just heard for the last 30-something minutes. And as always, if you want to support our show, it's called Coffin Talk. Head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com and sign up for the once-a-week email I send out. Thank you again, everyone, for listening. My name is Mike Oppenheim. You've been listening to Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.